Hey Furies, the next installment of the Elder Scrolls series is confirmed to be coming, and while we don't know for sure which province the game will be based in, I feel that what the trailer tells us about which province it'll be has been thoroughly discussed by others, and the community largely agrees that it'll be based in High Rock, the northwestmost province in Tamriel. This is both based on the scenery and the style of music that you can hear. So we'll be making this video on that assumption. So today we'll be discussing the possible storylines, the gameplay style, and what the setting will actually be like. This is High Rock. So what kind of game would one set in High Rock be like? In Lady Cinnabeth's The Knightly Orders of High Rock, she writes that the Breton passion for feudal hierarchy pervades every aspect of High Rock society, from the lowliest peasant to the High King. In Cyrodiil, there are the Colovians and the Nebonese, in Hammerfell there are the Crowns and the Forebears, but they all still operate as one nation together. They have a cohesion to them. The difference with High Rock is that, like the petty kingdoms in the old British Isles, High Rock has historically been made up of an endless multitude of city-states, principalities, baronies, duchies, and kingdoms, which have, until recently, resisted all attempts at centralization into a single culture or government. The point is that this region has a history of internal strife, civil war, and rising and falling kingdoms and royal families, and it's likely that the game will really utilize that backdrop as its starting point, that its story and gameplay style will be drawn out of that idea. However, come the 4th era and some 200 years after a magical event known as the Warp in the West, High Rock was left with only a small number of kingdoms. While not so fragmented as they were before and they were throughout history, it still has these competing factions that we'll probably see play into the story of the game. It's fundamentally a medieval and feudal society. We know from the book Etiquette with Rulers that High Rock uses titles like Your Grace, King, Queen, Prince, Princess, Duchess, Dowager Queen, Duke, along with lords and ladies, and they have major and minor houses, titles and concepts that you might recognize from stories like A Game of Thrones. It takes a lot from the culture of the European medieval court, and with that it brings a whole lot of really interesting stuff that we haven't focused on before. Court intrigue, political maneuvering, conspiracy against one another, as each of these factions try to outcompete their neighbouring kingdoms, not just on the battlefield but in diplomacy, in alliances, assassinations, dimensions of play that we really haven't focused on before. Not in the sense that this setting really provides for. Crucially, Britons have a long history and are well known for espionage, for spying, sabotage, playing both sides of the battle, playing enemies against one another. During the Roman conquests, it's noted that there was a Breton spy in the Imperial army. I am working for you because not everyone can say they've spied for a god, and they said it would be profitable. In the history of Cyrodiil, it notes that the Britons were sent back, where they decided to combat the Emperor's espionage with their own. Whereas Skyrim had us fighting monsters and these otherworldly creatures, I think this game really provides for an opportunity to have more human antagonists in a sense, with a lot more grey morality thrown into it. You can't just fusradar your enemies off a cliff in High Rock, you have to outmaneuver them or make them your ally. Perhaps the most powerful person in High Rock is someone that nobody's really ever heard of, that just exists in the shadows, holding the right secret over the lords and ladies. High Rock is very used to underhanded strategy in the royal court, and if they focus on that style of gameplay, I think it would be a fantastic shift in tone from our previous games. Morrowind had a morally grey fantasy adventure story, Oblivion had a very black and white save the world type story, and Skyrim had its own end of the world chosen one story, narrowing in on the fate of just one province out of all of them in Tamriel, with the main quest not having Daedric plans involved, but rather more strategy and cunning would be an excellent way to keep the tone fresh and the playstyle interesting. There are also major and minor houses working against one another, like House Tamrith, House Dorell, and House Montclair. There was this mechanic used in Daggerfall, and somewhat in Morrowind, called Reputation. If you side with one house or kingdom, then it decreases or increases your reputation depending on who they are enemies with or who they are allied with at the time. This can make trading harder, getting secrets out of their citizens harder, or getting them to give you quests, to the point that maybe guards would even kill you on sight for how well you are known as an enemy. Likewise, an increase in reputation can make those things easier, and it can be up to you as to how you use your reputation in any given place. It suddenly creates a playstyle where you have to be conscious of who you're working for, who you're working with, even tangentially, which fits really well with the High Rock setting. It's notable that in the wake of the secession of Blackmarsh and elsewhere, the overthrow of Valenwood, the destruction of Morrowind, the rise of the Aldmeri Dominion, the betrayal of Hammerfell, and the Great War, the Empire has never been in a more fragile state. Now, we don't quite know how many years on from Skyrim this game will be based in, how the Empire might have changed, but if it's anything like the situation was back then it's unlikely that the Empire will have the resources or the manpower to step in and prevent conflict between these factions within High Rock. I reckon that will really be something that facilitates the tension between them in the story. Now, with this shift in narrative focus may also come a change in how the player character goes about their quest. So for the Dragonborn, you're called the Dragonborn, this fearless hero, essentially from the very start of the game. You get other titles like the Thane of Whiterun virtually from the beginning as well, but High Rock is a very meritocratic society. The Britons really value the talents and skills and efforts of the individual. That was how they came to power in High Rock in the first place. They traded their way into power over the Nords, and kind of commerce is a very big part of their society. And a lot of stories about High Rock show that there's a lot of social mobility, the capacity to rise in the ranks if you're smart, talented, and hardworking. There's this Briton saying that goes, find a new hill, become a king, and this is partly because of how many factions are usually in play, like there were over 400 kings at one point, but it's also because the culture of the Britons accepts these people who rise in the ranks, rather than looking down on them. There are still families which are traditionally more powerful or royal or wealthy, but there's not that sense of illegitimacy or looking down upon them just because they came from the peasantry and rose in the ranks to wealth. There are even tales of Briton kings and queens marrying peasants or commoners that they fall in love with. There's very much that Arthurian chivalry feeling to it. We can read that it's not uncommon for commoners to be inducted into what are known as the knightly orders, where the commoner is rewarded for achievements other than in conflict, and this is the case in the majority of knighthoods. The membership in the local knightly order is only nominal, however. If their achievements are in the all-important realm of trade, this new merchant knight is expected to contribute heavily and regularly to the order's financial maintenance. Rather than inheriting titles or having us immediately be recognized as something prophetic, titles have to be earned in High Rock. And we'll likely get titles from these different kingdoms, from these different factions, and this may well play into the reputation mechanics that we touched on before. The higher the title you have with one kingdom, the more it affects how you interact with the others. We could become dukes or duchesses, or even perhaps kings in our own little kingdom, on our own hill, as the saying goes. Buy a keep, employ NPCs to patrol the walls, and fend off attacks from rival houses. Though perhaps that's just my love for Age of Empires talking. It is also noted that, being battle-weary, the kingdoms of High Rock have eschewed violence recently in favour of diplomatic solutions. So choosing who you blackmail, who you have assassinated, or who you ally with may require a more complex skill tree as we have to deal with diplomacy, perhaps tracking the traits or opinions of different people in other factions, so that we can calculate attacking which person will have the best effect and in which way we should actually attack them. But at the same time as court intrigue, there will inevitably be skirmishes and battles to participate in. You may even play a role in deciding which strategies the different kingdoms use against one another. The crucial point is that High Rock is a chess game, and you begin as a pawn and may end up as a king. You must be a strategist and must rise in the ranks. High Rock also opens up a number of opportunities for the guilds, particularly the Dark Brotherhood. So in the recent centuries, the Dark Brotherhood has been pretty much decimated by riots, Empire and Dominion raids, and the Great War between 171 and 175 of the Fourth Era. Cicero notes that in the year 188 of the Fourth Era that Wayrest is lost. The city fell to Corsairs. The Wayrest Sanctuary was raided and destroyed by the Corsairs. there were no survivors. With the Dark Brotherhood broken across the continent, we may have to rebuild it in High Rock, which could work well with the varying kingdoms wishing to outplay one another by assassinating key players. A similar theme could work for the Thieves Guild, stealing information, heirlooms, or plans to help one group against another. You could manipulate them from behind the scenes, pulling the strings. As for the Fighters Guild, it does have a presence in High Rock with about 4 Fighters Guilds scattered across the province, but as we spoke about before, there are also a number of knightly orders. Every petty kingdom and duchy in High Rock has its own knightly order, with traditions that supposedly date back to the glory days of the Breton liberation. The Knights of the Dragon in Daggerfall, the Knights of the Flame in Alcaire, the Order of St. Pellin in Evermore, the list goes on and on. Joining these orders could provide a standard Fighters Guild questline within each region, dealing with their internal problems, but what would be important is to give each of them a distinct character, so that there is a reason that they have to be separate, that there are loyalty factors involved. Rather than having the same faction across each of these kingdoms, they should have defined values and histories and principles that guide what they do. Now, the Mages Guild is a little bit more complex because we know that following the Oblivion Crisis, the Mages Guild was mostly dissolved across Tamriel due to an anti-magic sentiment, and it's noted that one need not be a member of the Mages Guild to know that this carefully contrived hierarchy has become nothing more than an intricate morass of political infighting. And in its collapse, 2 groups called the Synod and the College of Whispers sprung up, but it's not clear if this happened in High Rock, because magic is really important to the Bretons. They have a culture that values and respects it. Bretons are the magically adept and resistant descendants of the ancient Aldmer and the early Needs. Unlike in Skyrim and perhaps Cyrodiil, where magic is far rarer and more mistrusted, magic is very common in High Rock. It's in a lot of places and a lot of people have it, so it's not entirely clear if the Mages Guild would have collapsed entirely in the same way it did throughout the rest of the continent. It may have continued on in some fashion if under a different name, and so whether or not the Synod or the College of Whispers have a strong presence in High Rock is yet to be discovered. As in, there's a whole group of upper-class magically talented individuals, and it didn't matter if they were born poor. Children are tested for their magical potential at an early age, and those who pass enter apprenticeship programs funded by the guild itself or through independent sponsorship. This sort of culture doesn't just die out, it's a career path. We'd be looking at a really interesting Mages questline, particularly around Camlorn, whose army has a large contingent of proficient mages. Magic thrives in High Rock. It is very much that Tolkien-esque high fantasy setting. Now, we actually know very little of what the political state of High Rock is by the time of Skyrim, in the year 201 of the 4th era, whether or not the same kingdoms even still remain, but the ones that we could see might include the Kingdom of Northpoint, the Kingdom of Daggerfall, the Principality of Camlorn, Wayrest, the State of Evermore, the Kingdom of Gehenna, Faerûn, Shornhelm, and Orsinium. Many of these have allied with one another or unified throughout the years, but we don't quite know what state they'll be in, who'll be allied with who and who'll be enemies with who by the time of the 6th game. Though, as mentioned before, Wayrest was raided by Corsairs, and some people believe that the Corsairs set up a republic there. They took over, which would be interesting to have this kind of city-state of lawlessness that's very different, that's been taken over by a vastly different culture on the whole. And each of these kingdoms have a distinct culture, ruling families, and economic and military interests, though it is noted that, nonetheless, their language, bardic traditions, and heroic legends are a unifying common legacy between each of them. Because you might wonder why, if they're constantly in conflicts, they're not just their own small provinces. They sort of have a big brother, little brother relationship, it seems. The I can pick on him, but nobody else can, which is why they tend to unite together to fight against either Hammerfell or the Orc invasions occasionally. And this is where we need to talk about Orsinium, the city-state of the Orcs, the pariah folk. It has been destroyed by the Bretons numerous times throughout history, with each time they're moving and rebuilding somewhere else. In the book Lord of Souls, we know that they set up Orsinium somewhere between Hammerfell and Skyrim, and while perhaps not immediately part of High Rock, Orsinium could be based in the Hrothgar Mountains, and we'll still see a strong Orozma presence, and especially with the tensions between them and Evermore, and Wayrest and Gehenna. And these tensions are from generations old blood feuds, but also a cultural difference, with Bretons being very magical and Orcs, well, not so much. Now in terms of the geography of High Rock, it has some Dwemer ruins, some Ayleid-styled ruins like you might remember from Oblivion that have been left over from the Doreni hegemony, a ruling class of Ayleid-type elves from an age past when Bretons were simply peasants, second-class citizens beneath elves, as well as forts from old abandoned short-lived kingdoms and old ruins from each Orsinium that has been razed to the ground. It's incredibly varied in its landscape, from dense forestry to highlands to stormy craglands, the Doom Crag, and guess what? High Rocks. Parts of it are also permeated with ancient magics with unknown effects on the environment. All of these things together sound like a fantastic fantasy land that will be amazing to explore. Now, while the High Rock setting provides the perfect backdrop for a non-supernatural heavy storyline, there is one curious detail about High Rock that has a lot to do with ancient magics, the Daedra and the Aedra, and setting the game here, of all places across Tamriel, may mean it's involved in the main quest, and there is good reason to think so. The Doreni Tower in the Isle of Belfiera. It's an enigmatic structure, a circular tower soaring hundreds of feet into the sky. A recent archaeological study, using the latest techniques in divination and sorcery, has pushed the tower's construction back to around the year 2500 of the Merethic era, making it by far the oldest known structure in Tamriel. Its core is a smooth cylinder of shining metal. The tower is believed to extend at least as far beneath the surface, although its deepest bowels have never been systematically explored. How insanely curious does that make you? This description somewhat captures its ancient and magical roots and significance. Legends say that this was where the Aedra met for something called the Convention. The gods made a great tower to discuss how best to proceed with the making of Mundus. The physical, temporal, spiritual and magical elements of Nirn were set at this convention, and the tower itself remained. The Doreni Tower. The tower's roots go right back to creation, but it may have more significance in the story because of one thing in particular: the Thalmor. Now this is getting into the highly theoretical and weird side of Elder Scrolls lore, but there is a lot of evidence to support the idea that reality itself in the Orbrus, the universe, is held up by these metaphysical and physical structures called the Towers, and every tower has a stone. The Doreni Tower, otherwise known as the Adamantine Tower, is one of these. The overarching story behind each of the games recently seems to have been the destruction of these towers or their stones, sometimes accidentally and sometimes purposefully. For example, the Red Mountain in Morrowind is another tower, but its stone was destroyed at the end of the third game. The Heart of Lorkhan, the Nerevarine destroys it in order to stop Dagoth-Ur. Then, not long after that, in the 5th year of the 4th era, Red Mountain erupted. And in Oblivion we have the White Gold Tower, which is the tower that you can see rising out in the centre of the Imperial City, and it too has a stone, which was part of the Amulet of Kings, which if you remember was used to stop Mehrunes Dagon and close the Gates of Oblivion. In this, 2 towers are no longer functioning. The point of this is that the Doreni Tower next to High Rock is the only remaining tower that we know is functioning. Theoretically, it may be the only thing holding the laws of reality, of time, together. But why is this important, and how does this relate to the Thalmor? Because despite the signing of the White Gold Concordat between the Empire and the Thalmor in 175, tensions are still high, and the Thalmor have actively described it as only the first war against the Empire, implying that they shall wage more. If the series continues down this path of tensions between the two and the fragmentation of the Empire, we may see the Thalmor further their goals. But what is their end goal? What do they want, really? One out-of-game source, so take this with a grain of salt, is the Numantia Intercept, which does make sense of their philosophy and their actions so far, such as why they are so adamant about banning Talos worship. With Talos and the Sons of Talos removed, the dragon will become ours to unbind, the world of mortals will be over, the dragon will uncoil his hold in the stagnancy of linear time and move as free serpent again, moving through the ether without measure or burden, spilling time along the innumerable roads we once travelled, and with that we will regain the mantle of the imperishable spirit. Now I know that sounds like gibberish and that nothing makes sense anymore, but what it essentially means is that by undoing each of the towers, the Thalmor believe that they can undo time and reality itself. that they can then ascend to their immortal forms again, essentially becoming immortal spirits. That's what they aim to do, to destroy reality and regain their immortal form. That could be the reason it's based in High Rock, to pursue either the saving or the destruction of that tower. And as we read in the original description, nobody has explored the true depths of the Direnni Tower. Given its roots and creation, we can only imagine what might be hidden beneath it. What is down there? This might give us a chance to truly explore that. That would be fascinating, to go to the foundation of Tamriel itself. But that is far more hypothetical, and it pained me to go into so little detail about that theory just there, because those who watch my Elder Scrolls videos will know that I tend to take very specific topics and not brush over details, or at least I try not to. So doing this whole broad discussion thing is pretty new to me. One of the other things that we could see play into the story in High Rock is if they include the Slode, given how close we are to Thras, their continent just west of High Rock. The Slode are a deeply magical and powerful race of slug-like beings that have been seen very rarely throughout the Elder Scrolls. I think they've been seen once in Redguard and also in ESO. In the year 2200 of the First Era, they sent the devastating Thracian Plague, and there was a lot of bad blood between them and the Bretons because of it. The number of people in all of the areas in Iliac Bay was halved once in the First Era by the Thracian Plague, with the Bretons joining the All Flags Navy to go and wipe out the Slode entirely. That was their vengeance. To be clear though, this plague carried on for generations in High Rock. It has not been forgotten easily. Entire families were wiped out. Bringing up the blood between these two groups may be a potential story for High Rock. It would also allow for some amazing magic stuff, because the Slode are traditionally into pretty dark magic, and given how powerful both the Slode and Bretons are, we could see some pretty amazing magic. But that is all from me. If you would like to join the Discord where we talk about Elder Scrolls as well as any of the other topics that I have on my channel, then feel free to come support me on Patreon for just a couple of dollars a month. Really does mean the world, especially as I'm going into doing this full time. Let me know what you would like to see in the Elder Scrolls 6, particularly in High Rock. If you'd like to see it in Hammerfell, tell me why you'd like to see it in Hammerfell down in the comments below. Stay nerdy, Subfuries, and I will see you in the future.